He wasn't supposed to stay. Most abandoned dogs bolt the second the chain falls away, disappearing into the trees before anyone can stop them. But this one didn't even take a full step. He simply stood there beneath the fading light, breathing slowly, his amber eyes fixed on something hidden beyond the old fence line, as though freedom itself could wait a little longer. The October wind drifted quietly across the forgotten hills outside Ash Hollow, Pennsylvania, carrying the scent of damp leaves, weathered cedar, and earth that had not been disturbed in years. Evening settled over the abandoned farmland with a silence so complete it seemed the land had forgotten how to welcome footsteps. Caleb Hayes eased his pickup onto the cracked gravel shoulder and killed the engine. At 36, the former United States Marine had learned to trust the feeling that settled deep inside his chest whenever something wasn't quite right. It wasn't fear. It was instinct, sharpened through years of service and polished by loneliness after returning home. He had spent the last 2 years repairing barns, fences, and forgotten places for people who rarely asked questions. Quiet suited him better than sympathy ever had. As he stepped from the truck, the metallic clink echoed again through the trees. Not machinery. A chain. Slow. Uneven. Alive. Caleb followed the sound until the overgrown brush opened into the remains of an old homestead. The farmhouse leaned tiredly against time, its windows hollow, its porch swallowed by vines. Beside what had once been a tool shed stood a massive white oak, its roots twisting through broken stone like old fingers refusing to let go. There, fastened to a rusted iron stake driven deep into the ground, stood the German Shepherd. His sable coat, though dulled by dust and weather, still hinted at remarkable strength beneath the scars of neglect. His ears remained upright despite exhaustion, his posture calm rather than frightened. Around his neck hung a heavy steel chain worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and snow. The dog watched Caleb carefully, but never growled, never backed away. Their eyes met across 20 feet of fallen leaves, and for a long moment neither moved. Caleb slowly crouched, lowering himself until he appeared smaller. "Easy, buddy," he said softly, his voice carrying the quiet steadiness that had once calmed frightened recruits and nervous rescue dogs overseas. "Nobody's leaving you here tonight." The shepherd blinked once. His tail remained still, but something in his expression softened. Caleb reached into his truck, retrieved a pair of bolt cutters, and returned with deliberate patience. The old chain resisted at first, corroded by decades of weather, until one sharp squeeze broke the final link with a heavy snap that echoed through the empty property. The dog lowered his head as the weight fell into the grass. For one heartbeat, Caleb expected the shepherd to vanish into the woods. Instead, the animal turned slowly toward the towering oak. He looked back once, making certain Caleb was following. Then, without a single bark, he began walking into the darkening forest, stopping every few yards to glance behind him, as though he had been waiting not for freedom, but for someone willing to uncover a promise buried long before either of them had arrived. The shepherd moved with quiet certainty, weaving between towering maples whose branches filtered the last strands of daylight into ribbons of gold across the forest floor. Caleb followed several yards behind, careful not to crowd him. There was something deliberate in the animal's pace. He never wandered, never sniffed aimlessly, never chased the squirrels darting through the underbrush. Every few moments he paused, turned his head just enough to make sure Caleb remained behind him, then continued deeper into woods that had clearly been left untouched for decades. Fallen leaves muffled every footstep until the forest itself seemed to breathe in silence. A cool breeze carried the rich scent of wet moss, old bark, and the faint sweetness of wild asters growing between weathered stones. Somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called into the approaching evening, its lonely cry drifting through the trees like an echo from another lifetime. Caleb had learned long ago that animals rarely wasted energy. During his years overseas, military working dogs had sensed dangers no equipment could detect and found survivors long before rescue teams ever arrived. He had trusted them then because experience had taught him that instinct often spoke more honestly than certainty. As he watched the German shepherd now, that same quiet conviction settled into his chest. This was not the behavior of a frightened stray searching for shelter. This was purpose, They crossed the remains of an old split-rail fence almost hidden beneath climbing ivy before entering a clearing where nature had slowly reclaimed everything man had abandoned. Stone foundations peeked through blankets of fern. Rusted farm tools rested half-buried beneath roots. A weathered hand pump leaned at an impossible angle, wrapped in vines thick as rope. Time had not erased this place. It had simply folded it into the landscape. The shepherd slowed beside what appeared to have once been a narrow wagon trail before stopping completely near an enormous moss-covered boulder. He lowered his nose, inhaled deeply, then looked toward Caleb again. His amber eyes reflected the fading light with remarkable calm. Caleb approached, kneeling beside him. "What are you trying to show me?" he whispered. The dog answered only by stepping forward another few feet toward a cluster of ancient white oaks standing close together like silent guardians. Their trunks were massive, easily 4 feet across, their bark scarred by lightning and countless winters. One tree carried an old iron horseshoe nailed high above eye level, almost swallowed by decades of growth. Caleb reached out and brushed away layers of green moss from the weathered metal. Someone had placed it there a very long time ago. The shepherd circled the largest tree once, then settled quietly beside its exposed roots. He did not bark. He simply sat, watching the ground beneath him with unwavering focus. Caleb scanned the area carefully. The soil looked different here. While the surrounding forest floor lay covered in thick leaves and tangled vegetation, this patch appeared strangely level, almost as though countless seasons had gently concealed something beneath it. Tiny depressions interrupted the earth in uneven patterns, and fragments of old stone protruded through the dirt where roots refused to grow. Caleb rested one hand against the rough bark of the oak, feeling the cool texture beneath his fingertips. The tree had likely stood there for more than a century, silently witnessing generations come and disappear. Behind him, the evening wind shifted again, carrying the distant ringing of a church bell from somewhere beyond the hills. One slow note drifted through the forest before fading into stillness. The shepherd rose to his feet without hesitation. He walked to a single patch of earth no larger than a dining table, lowered his nose once more, and began scratching gently through the leaves with careful, patient strokes, never frantic, never desperate, as though he already knew that beneath the quiet soil rested something the world had forgotten but had never truly lost. The gentle scratching continued with quiet determination until the shepherd suddenly stopped and lifted his head. His ears stood perfectly still, catching sounds Caleb could not hear, before he looked down again and touched the same patch of earth with one careful paw. There was no panic in his movements, only patience. Caleb removed a pair of worn leatherwork gloves from his jacket pocket and knelt beside the tree. The soil felt unusually soft beneath the thick blanket of leaves, as though time itself had protected whatever rested below. He picked up a fallen branch and carefully brushed away the loose layer of moss, exposing darker earth untouched by sunlight for countless seasons. The rich scent of damp soil drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable smell of old roots and forgotten years. The shepherd remained beside him, watching every movement without making a sound. As the first few inches of dirt gave way, Caleb noticed something unnatural beneath the roots. A narrow edge of weathered wood emerged, darkened almost black by age, but still remarkably solid. He paused and brushed away more dirt with the palm of his hand. It was not part of the tree. It was carefully shaped, straight, and unmistakably placed there by human hands. Caleb frowned. Someone buried something here, he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The shepherd lowered his nose and gently nudged Caleb's elbow, encouraging him to continue. The fading sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing, while tiny particles of dust floated through narrow beams of golden light. Everything around them remained perfectly still. Even the breeze seemed to have paused. Caleb worked slowly, refusing to force anything loose. Years of repairing old homes had taught him that history deserved patience. A few more careful minutes revealed what appeared to be the corner of a small wooden chest reinforced with rusted iron bands. Most of the metal had surrendered to corrosion long ago, yet enough remained to show careful craftsmanship from another generation. Thick roots curled around its sides without crushing it, almost as though the forest itself had grown around the hidden object instead of through it. Caleb sat back on his heels, surprised by the discovery. It made no sense. Why would someone bury a chest beneath an ancient oak so far from the abandoned farmhouse? Before he could consider the question any longer, the shepherd quietly stood and walked several feet toward another patch of ground. He stopped, looked back, then returned to the chest without hesitation, repeating the strange pattern as if trying to connect two places separated by only a few yards. Caleb studied the dog's behavior carefully. The animal was not guarding the chest. He was guiding him through a story that had not yet been fully uncovered. With both hands, Caleb carefully loosened the remaining dirt until the old lid became visible. It resisted at first, held in place by decades of packed earth, but eventually shifted just enough to reveal a narrow opening. Inside lay a layer of faded canvas wrapped around several objects protected from moisture by careful hands long ago. Caleb gently unfolded one corner of the brittle fabric. Resting beneath it was a tarnished brass compass, its cracked glass still protecting a needle that trembled faintly before settling north. Beside it lay an old leather notebook whose cover had nearly turned the color of the surrounding earth. Finally, tucked beneath both items, Caleb noticed the edge of a military identification tag attached to a worn chain. He froze. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. He recognized the shape instantly. Countless Marines carried the same kind throughout their service. The shepherd quietly stepped closer and rested his head beside Caleb's shoulder, not with excitement, but with the quiet relief of one who had finally brought someone to the place he had been trying to find all along. Caleb held the worn identification tag carefully between his fingers, brushing away decades of dirt with the sleeve of his flannel jacket. The cool metal reflected one final ribbon of evening sunlight before settling back into shadow. Time had softened the stamped letters, but not enough to erase them. He could make out only fragments of a name and the unmistakable words United States Marine Corps. His breathing slowed. Every Marine understood the weight carried by a simple piece of metal like this. It was never just identification. It was a promise that no one would be forgotten. The shepherd remained close beside him, his amber eyes fixed not on the tag, but on the old notebook still resting inside the weathered chest. Caleb reached for it with both hands, supporting the brittle leather as though lifting something sacred. The cover cracked gently but held together. A faded eagle had been pressed into the front years before, nearly erased by time. He opened it carefully. Most of the pages had fused together from moisture, but several near the center separated with surprising ease. The handwriting was neat, steady, and unmistakably personal. Dates appeared first, autumn of 1988. Short notes followed, describing weather, supply deliveries, long workdays restoring an abandoned property owned by an elderly veteran, and simple observations that sounded more like letters to oneself than official records. Caleb smiled faintly. The writer had noticed small things. Cardinals gathering before sunrise. Fresh coffee drifting across the porch. Rain tapping against old windows. It reminded him that soldiers carried ordinary hearts beneath extraordinary responsibilities. Then one sentence caught his attention. If anything happens, the truth belongs beneath the old white oak until someone worthy finds it. Caleb quietly read the line again. The shepherd gently leaned against his shoulder, almost as if he already knew those words had finally been spoken aloud. A chill drifted through the clearing despite the calm evening air. Caleb turned another fragile page. Most of the ink had faded beyond recognition, but a folded sheet remained tucked between the pages, protected by the notebook itself. He unfolded it with slow, careful movements. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding property. The abandoned farmhouse stood near the southern edge. A narrow creek curved along the eastern woods. Several landmarks had been marked with small circles, including the giant white oak beneath which Caleb now knelt. One final mark rested farther north beside a handwritten note that simply read, "Do not let them erase what happened here." Caleb studied the map in silence. Whoever had hidden this chest had expected someone else to come looking one day. Not immediately, perhaps not even within a lifetime, but eventually. The fading daylight settled into deep blue as the first evening stars appeared between the branches overhead. Crickets began their quiet chorus, filling the forest with a peaceful rhythm that somehow made the discovery feel even more profound. Caleb carefully returned the notebook and compass to the chest before slipping the identification tag into his shirt pocket for safekeeping. He did not feel like he had uncovered buried treasure. He felt as though someone from another generation had reached through time and placed a responsibility into his hands. The shepherd suddenly stood, his ears lifting toward the northern trees. He did not bark. He simply turned and looked in the direction marked on the old map, waiting once more with calm certainty. Caleb followed his gaze until the darkness swallowed the narrow path ahead. Somewhere beyond those silent woods rested another piece of a story that had remained unfinished for nearly 4 decades. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the faithful dog seemed determined to see that its final chapter would at last be written. The narrow trail marked on the faded map wound deeper into the northern woods, where the trees grew older and the air carried the cool fragrance of pine, damp stone, and fallen leaves left undisturbed through countless autumns. Caleb carefully closed the weathered chest and concealed it beneath a layer of loose earth and moss exactly as he had found it. Whatever story rested inside deserved protection until he understood it completely. The shepherd waited a few yards ahead, standing perfectly still beneath the dim glow of a rising moon. There was no impatience in his posture, only quiet confidence. Caleb slipped the notebook and the folded map into his backpack, while the military identification tag remained safely inside his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Together they continued north. The forest gradually changed around them. Young saplings gave way to towering hemlocks, whose branches blocked much of the evening sky. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath Caleb's boots became the only sound besides the steady rhythm of the shepherd's breathing. Nearly half a mile later, the trees opened into another forgotten clearing. Unlike the abandoned farmhouse, this place carried subtle signs that people had once gathered here. A crumbling stone wall outlined what might have been a family cemetery long ago. Most of the headstones had tilted with age, their names erased by rain and winter frost. Wildflowers had rooted themselves between the weathered markers, bringing unexpected beauty to a place that had quietly slipped from memory. The shepherd walked directly toward the far edge of the clearing before stopping beside an old iron gate lying flat beneath vines. Caleb knelt to inspect it. The hinges had long since separated from their posts, but one small bronze plaque remained attached. He wiped away layers of dirt until a single family name appeared. Whitmore. The name stirred something distant in his memory. Earlier that year, he had repaired a porch for an elderly neighbor who mentioned the Whitmore estate, saying the family had disappeared from the valley decades before after a dispute nobody liked to discuss. Caleb had paid little attention then. Now the forgotten conversation returned with surprising clarity. The shepherd suddenly lifted his head toward the eastern edge of the clearing. Caleb followed his gaze and noticed the faint outline of a narrow gravel road beyond the trees. Tire tracks crossed its surface. Fresh ones. Someone had driven there within the past day despite the property appearing abandoned. A quiet uneasiness settled over him. Places forgotten by history rarely received recent visitors. He remained still until the distant hum of an engine faded into the night. Only then did he breathe normally again. The shepherd gently nudged Caleb's hand before walking toward a weathered stone monument standing alone beneath another massive oak. Unlike the surrounding grave markers, this one bore no name. Only a carved Marine Corps emblem remained visible beneath decades of moss. Caleb carefully brushed the stone clean. Beneath the emblem, barely visible in the moonlight, another sentence emerged. Honor remembers what silence cannot erase. The words echoed the message hidden inside the notebook. This was no coincidence. Whoever had hidden the chest had also left a trail, piece by piece, place by place, almost as though they trusted that one day the right person would follow the same path with the help of a faithful dog. Caleb rested one hand against the cold stone while the shepherd quietly sat beside him, looking not at the monument, but toward the darkness beyond the clearing where the old gravel road disappeared into the hills. Somewhere out there, someone still knew why these messages had been hidden, why an abandoned German shepherd had been left chained near the old farmhouse, and why the truth had waited so patiently beneath the trees for nearly 40 years. Caleb did not leave the valley that night. Instead, he drove the old pickup to the small diner on the edge of Ash Hollow just before closing, the kind of place where coffee was always hot and conversations lingered longer than the meals. Ranger settled quietly beneath the booth beside him, drawing a few curious glances but never making a sound. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Evelyn Parker, recognized Caleb from previous repair jobs and smiled warmly before setting a fresh mug on the table. "Long day?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded. "Longer than I expected." His eyes drifted toward a collection of faded black and white photographs hanging along the opposite wall. One picture showed a group of local veterans standing beside a courthouse nearly 40 years earlier. Another captured a Memorial Day parade from the late 1980s. Then one photograph caught his attention completely. An older man stood beside a young Marine in dress blues. Behind them rose the familiar outline of the Whitmore farmhouse. Caleb quietly stood and walked closer. The Marine looked no older than 25, smiling with the calm confidence carried by those who believed tomorrow would always come. Around his neck hung the same style of identification tag Caleb had discovered beneath the white oak. Evelyn noticed where he was looking. "That was Daniel Whitmore," she said gently. "Good young man. Everyone thought the world of him." Caleb turned slowly. "What happened to him?" Evelyn sighed, folding a clean towel between her hands. "Depends on who you ask back then. Officially, people said he left town after his military service. Others believed he disappeared while helping settle family matters after his father passed away. Nobody ever agreed. After a few years, folks simply stopped talking about it." Caleb reached into his pocket and gently touched the identification tag without removing it. "Did he have a dog?" Evelyn paused. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. "A German shepherd," she answered. "Beautiful animal. Loyal beyond words." The whole town knew those two belonged together. Caleb felt a quiet weight settle over him. Ranger lifted his head beneath the table as though listening to every word. "What was the dog's name?" Caleb asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Valor." Silence filled the diner for several long seconds. Caleb looked down at the shepherd lying peacefully at his feet. The dog's coat carried fresh scars and silver hairs that suggested many difficult years, but not nearly enough to have lived since 1988. This could not be the same dog. Yet somehow the connection refused to let go. Before Caleb could ask another question, the bell above the front door chimed softly. A tall man wearing a dark work jacket stepped inside. He appeared to be in his early 60s with neatly combed gray hair and the steady posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes settled briefly on Caleb before drifting toward Ranger. The warmth disappeared from his face almost instantly. "That dog belongs near the Whitmore place?" he asked in an unusually calm voice. Caleb met his gaze. "I found him chained." The man hesitated only a moment before forcing a polite smile. "Old properties hide old problems. Best leave them buried." Without waiting for a reply, he purchased a newspaper from the counter and quietly walked back into the cool October night. Evelyn watched through the window until his truck disappeared beyond the intersection. Then she leaned closer to Caleb and lowered her voice. "That was Walter Grayson. He owns most of the land surrounding the Whitmore property now." Caleb looked toward the empty doorway where the stranger had stood only moments earlier. Ranger slowly rose to his feet beside him, his ears alert, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness outside. For the first time since freeing the faithful shepherd, Caleb realized they were no longer the only ones following the trail that had waited beneath the trees for nearly 40 years. Morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky that stretched across the valley like a quiet promise. A thin layer of mist drifted above the fields surrounding the abandoned Whitmore property, softening every fence post, every weathered stone, every forgotten corner that had waited patiently through the passing decades. Caleb parked his pickup beneath the same towering white oak where the hidden chest still rested safely beneath the earth. Ranger stepped out beside him, lifting his nose toward the cool autumn breeze before walking directly toward the old trail without hesitation. There was no uncertainty in his stride. It was as though daylight had only sharpened the purpose that had guided him through the night before. Caleb carried a small backpack containing the notebook, the folded map, fresh gloves, bottled water, and a compact camera. He had decided that whatever they discovered today deserved to be documented with care rather than disturbed by haste. The forest greeted them with the familiar scent of damp leaves, cedar, and rich black soil. Sunlight filtered through the golden canopy in narrow beams that danced across the ground, while tiny drops of dew clung to spider webs stretched between low branches like delicate strands of silver thread. Ranger led him past the family cemetery and continued beyond the broken stone monument bearing the Marine Corps emblem. The old map showed one final mark farther north, almost at the edge of the original Whitmore land. The path gradually narrowed until it disappeared beneath thick patches of fern and moss. Caleb paused to compare the faded sketch with the landscape around him. A shallow creek crossed the woods exactly where the map suggested, though time had changed its course slightly. On the opposite bank stood the remains of a small stone foundation hidden beneath vines. It looked too modest to have been a house, perhaps a spring house or an old storage building. Ranger stopped beside the collapsed wall and began sniffing carefully along its edge before scratching gently at a cluster of flat stones partially buried beneath moss. Caleb knelt and lifted one stone after another. Beneath them rested a rusted metal box no larger than a toolbox. Unlike the wooden chest, this container had been sealed tightly. He carefully pried it open with the blade of his pocket knife. Inside rested several yellowed envelopes wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably preserved despite the passing years. The first envelope carried a handwritten name, Daniel Whitmore. The second simply read, "If this is found, please finish what I could not." Caleb unfolded the letter with steady hands. The ink had faded but remained readable. Daniel wrote that he had uncovered documents proving the Whitmore land had been promised years earlier to a charitable veterans trust established by his late father. Before the transfer could be completed, powerful financial interests had attempted to erase every legal record connected to the donation. Rather than allow the documents to disappear forever, Daniel had hidden certified copies throughout the property, believing that truth could survive longer than greed if protected by honest hands. Caleb continued reading as the forest around him seemed to fall perfectly silent. Daniel never accused anyone by name. He never wrote with bitterness. Instead, every sentence carried remarkable peace. He believed that one day someone would uncover the evidence and restore the land to its intended purpose without hatred or revenge. At the bottom of the final page, another sentence appeared in careful handwriting. "Trust the dog. He will always remember the way home." Caleb slowly lowered the letter, unable to explain the warmth that settled across his heart. Ranger sat quietly beside him, watching not the papers but the narrow trail leading back toward the valley. The shepherd gently rested one paw against Caleb's boot before lifting his gaze toward the distant fields. Moments later, the quiet hum of an approaching engine floated through the trees. It was still far away, but close enough to remind Caleb they were no longer alone. Someone else had entered the property that morning, and instinct told him the race was no longer about finding hidden documents. It was about making certain the truth Daniel Whitmore had protected with such extraordinary patience would finally reach the people for whom it had always been intended. Caleb and Ranger remained hidden among the towering hemlocks until the distant engine finally fell silent. Neither of them moved. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy, warming patches of moss while cool shadows stretched between the ancient trees like quiet reminders that some places remembered far more than the people who walked through them. Caleb carefully folded Daniel Whitmore's letter and returned it to the oilcloth before securing the metal box inside his backpack. He knew those papers no longer belonged beneath the earth. They belonged in the hands of people who would preserve them with honesty. Ranger stood first, his ears turned toward the sound of slow footsteps approaching from the direction of the abandoned farmhouse. Instead of growling, the shepherd simply looked at Caleb, then gently nudged the backpack with his nose as if reminding him what mattered most. They slipped silently through the woods along a narrow deer trail that curved away from the approaching visitor. The path eventually led them to the small county historical society, housed inside a restored brick train depot on the edge of Ash Hollow. The building smelled faintly of old paper, polished oak, and coffee that had been warming since sunrise. Inside worked Margaret Ellis, the town historian, a woman in her early 70s whose quiet voice carried the patience of someone who believed every forgotten document deserved another chance to speak. Caleb introduced himself and carefully placed the notebook, the map, the identification tag, and Daniel's letter upon the reading table. Margaret adjusted her glasses without saying a word. As she examined the military identification tag, Her expression softened with immediate recognition. "Daniel Whitmore," she whispered almost reverently. "I remember the day the town held a prayer service after he disappeared. His mother came here every Thursday for years hoping someone had found another clue." She opened one of the preserved letters and slowly compared its signatures against archived property records stored inside an old filing cabinet. Nearly an hour passed in complete silence except for the gentle turning of brittle pages. Finally, Margaret looked up, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion. "These are authentic," she said. "The Whitmore estate truly was intended to become a permanent veterans retreat and rehabilitation center. The transfer was prepared, witnessed, and legally documented. The original records simply vanished before they reached the courthouse." Caleb sat quietly, absorbing the weight of her words. He had expected mystery. He had not expected hope waiting patiently beneath it. Margaret carefully unfolded another aging survey map from the archive and placed it beside Daniel's hand-drawn copy. Every boundary matched. Every landmark aligned perfectly. Even the white oak appeared exactly where Daniel had marked it decades earlier. "These documents restore the missing chain of ownership," she explained gently. "They do not accuse anyone. They simply allow the truth to stand on its own." Ranger rested peacefully beside Caleb's chair, his amber eyes following Margaret as she organized each paper into protective archival sleeves. For the first time since Caleb had found him chained beneath the old oak, the shepherd released a slow, contented sigh and lowered his head onto his front paws. It was such a small sound that anyone else might have missed it, but Caleb heard it clearly. It did not sound like exhaustion. It sounded like relief. Outside, church bells echoed softly across the valley as autumn sunlight settled over Ash Hollow. Caleb looked through the depot window toward the distant hills where the forgotten farmhouse still stood surrounded by silent trees. He realized that Ranger had never been searching for freedom alone. From the very beginning, the faithful dog had been leading someone toward a promise that had refused to disappear, trusting that even after so many years, truth still had a way of finding an honest heart willing to carry it the rest of the way. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet grace that no one in Ash Hollow could have imagined only days before. Margaret Ellis carefully delivered certified copies of Daniel Whitmore's letters, maps, and legal records to the county archives, where each document was examined, verified, and preserved exactly as he had hoped decades earlier. The forgotten transfer was finally recognized, and the Whitmore property was placed under the protection of the Veterans Trust Daniel's father had created so many years before. No celebration filled the valley. There were no grand speeches or dramatic headlines. Only a gentle sense that something unfinished had finally found its rightful ending. On a cool November afternoon, the townspeople gathered beneath the towering white oak where Caleb had first found Ranger waiting in silence. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder beside schoolchildren, farmers, teachers, and families who had lived in the valley their entire lives. An American flag stirred softly in the autumn breeze while golden leaves drifted through the sunlight like quiet blessings. A simple bronze marker was placed near the tree. It carried only a few words. "In honor of Daniel Whitmore." His promise endured. Caleb stood near the back of the gathering with Ranger resting peacefully at his side. He had never wanted recognition. He believed he had merely followed where a faithful dog had chosen to lead. Margaret stepped forward and carefully handed Caleb the restored military identification tag. "It belongs with the family now," she said softly. "But I think Daniel would have wanted you to carry it one last time." Caleb held the cool metal in his hand for a long moment before walking toward an elderly woman seated quietly beneath the oak. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, Daniel's younger sister. Time had silvered her hair and slowed her steps, but her eyes still carried the same gentle kindness visible in the faded photograph hanging inside the diner. Caleb knelt beside her and placed the tag carefully into her hands. Tears gathered in her eyes, yet her smile never faded. "I prayed someone would remember him," she whispered. "I just never imagined it would be through a dog." Caleb looked toward Ranger. The shepherd quietly walked to Eleanor, resting his head against her knee with remarkable gentleness. She stroked the soft fur between his ears as though greeting an old friend she had somehow known her entire life. For the first time since Caleb had found him chained beneath the forgotten oak, Ranger's expression seemed completely at peace. The quiet sadness that had lingered behind his amber eyes slowly gave way to something lighter, something almost joyful. As winter approached, volunteers began restoring the Whitmore farmhouse instead of tearing it down. The weathered porch was rebuilt. Broken windows welcomed light once again. The old fields were cleared not for profit, but for healing. Plans moved forward to transform the property into a retreat where veterans and their families could find rest beneath the same trees that had protected Daniel's promise for nearly 40 years. Caleb visited often, helping repair fences, straighten beams, and plant young maple trees along the winding driveway. Ranger followed him everywhere, no longer leading him toward hidden places because there were no more secrets left to uncover. One quiet evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the western hills, Caleb sat on the restored porch while Ranger lay peacefully at his feet. The valley glowed beneath shades of amber and crimson, and the wind carried the familiar scent of cedar, fallen leaves, and fresh earth. Caleb realized that he had believed he was rescuing a forgotten dog on an ordinary autumn evening. The truth had always been far gentler than that. A faithful German shepherd had rescued a forgotten promise, restored the honor of a family, and quietly guided one weary Marine back toward purpose. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes they wait patiently beneath old trees, carried through the years by loyalty that never asks for recognition, only for someone willing to follow where love quietly leads.